I mean, they gave us roads. Did they? I don't think they did at all. We had perfectly good roads before the Romans came. They gave us language. No, they didn't. We had a perfectly good language before the Latin arrived. They gave us laws. No, our laws weren't written down, but we had them. So they gave us civilization. No, they didn't give us civilization. We were civilized before the Romans came here.
It was the Romans who started all this barbarian nonsense. Their armies marched their way across Europe, labelling everything they saw uncivilized. Britain was considered to be particularly backward and strange. To find out more about this, I went to see my old friend and sparring partner, Guy de la Bédéère, a Roman supporter if ever I saw one.
Guy, I find it hard to believe that the sea actually came up there.
If you'd been able to stand here and look that way, Francis,
yeah,
on a clear day, you could have seen France and the Roman soldiers in their ships coming across in the year 43. If you'd been stupid enough to stand here waiting for them. The real problem is this the only place they landed? Yeah. Did they really land here on the first day, or did they land in several places at once? And the best clue we've got are the remains of a triumphal arch. Now, that's the sort of thing the Romans would have put up to commemorate a really important event. The symbolic gateway to Roman Britain.
Why were the Romans interested in Britain?
Florus talks about Britain being such a useless, ruddy, remote location. How wonderful the Roman Empire was to come here. We're absolutely on the edge of the known world. There's a huge box office, sales potential in coming here and bragging about having been here.
They always used to brag quite a lot, didn't they, the Romans?
Well, I think they had a lot to be proud of.
You do? Oh. Well, I don't know. I'd see that as a rather sad symbol myself.
I think the ordinary man in the street, presented with the sort of stability and security and financial system the Romans offered, if we think about the American system today, we might not like it, but actually most people, given push and shove, will accept that more than they will having instability and insecurity. And I think that means for ordinary people, it's very easy to see why they might have sat there whinging about the good old days and how they'd love to be back where they were before, while at the same time swigging Roman wine from a Roman cup in a nice Roman building with a nice Roman roof with a nice Roman central heating system.
Having lost their independence.
Well,
having lost their self-esteem.
What the Romans wiped out was a 10,000-year-old island culture, quite unlike any other in the ancient world. And for centuries, the reality of ancient Britain has remained veiled in mystery and confusion. The sheer energy of this culture is embodied for me by Maiden Castle in Dorset. This hill fort was seen as a site of a battle between the Romans and the Britons. In fact, it tells a much older story.
Maiden Castle has to be the most massive and spectacular pre-Roman site in Britain. And it's come to symbolize the vanished world of the Iron Age. But it was never as simple as that.
This site was actually occupied for 4,000 years before the Roman invasion. This is a huge stretch of time, which spans all the archaeological eras. The great hill fort defences were built in the Iron Age, which began 700 years before the Roman invasion. In the Bronze Age, which goes back to around 2,500 years BC, to when the pyramids of Egypt were built, people were living here, burying their dead in round barrows. And we know for a fact that a ceremonial meeting place was constructed here around 4000 BC, right back in the Stone Age. The Stone Age is the longest archaeological period and dates back to when humans first walked the earth, some 2 million years ago. When I became an archaeologist, I wasn't interested in excavating the ancient sites of Egypt, Greece or Rome. I wanted to investigate the far more mysterious story of ancient Britain. This story is not told in our history books. It's not even in the national curriculum.
Take the British Museum, this vast, imposing building. Still only has a tiny part of its floor space devoted to ancient Britain.
Yes, this is a great Roman gallery that really represents wonderful treasures from Roman Britain. Fabulous material, all that glass and silver. It says a great deal about Roman Britain. This is back into barbarian Britain, isn't it?
I feel more at home with this.
Absolutely.
Caroline, for me, this has to be one of the glories of the British Museum. It's an absolutely stunning object. How come we haven't got more British prehistoric stuff on display?
Before about 1850, the world that's perceived by the British Museum collecting was one of Greek and Rome, of the Bible lands, of ancient Egypt, and then the Oriental. And the native artifacts of Britain, our own, if you like, dirty, grubby native history, simply wasn't considered to be important.
So this would be considered barbarian stuff and not worth displaying?
Totally barbarian. And in fact, the empire was busy having conquests over people bearing shields like that. Of course, it wasn't considered to be very sophisticated.
For most people, the idea of ancient Britain conjures up visions of romantic, misty landscapes, strange myths and legends. A Braveheart meets Lord of the Rings type of thing. And most of us have been led to believe that this land was once populated by a red-haired group of rather artistic warriors known as the Celts. These ideas are now proven to be fantasy.
What we think of as a Celtic past is largely an invention, and it's largely a fiction. The term Celtic we can trace back to at least 400 or 500 BC, but it seems until about 1700 never to have been used about the people of Britain or Ireland. It's always just used of people living actually on the continent. At that time, people were starting to understand that there were important connections between our prehistoric ancestors in Britain and those on the continent. And in the first instance, people came to understand that their languages had apparently been similar. From that, people started to use this linguistic term as an ethnic label.
I can remember when I was at college, we learned that the Celts spread from Central Europe.
I think what we do see is the movement of, or the expansion from Central Europe of certain cultural traits, particularly in the physical things people were using, so-called Celtic art, as we call it today.
From the first, the weapons of the Celts, especially their swords, were good enough to make them a strong fighting power.
You could see so-called Celtic sword as being rather the equivalent of a BMW car today.
Yeah.
And the fact that lots of people in Britain drive around in BMW cars does not mean we've been invaded from Germany.
But that's just the mistake that some archaeologists have made about British prehistory.
We seem to be in some strange form of denial about our ancient past, where everything good has to come from across the Channel.
A little less than 4,000 years ago, the country was invaded by many warlike bands. These invaders already used metal, and their coming encouraged the growth of the bronze industry in this country.
This is now known to be false, even with Stonehenge.
People used to believe that Stonehenge was introduced to Britain from either ancient Egypt or Crete.
These notions have been radically overturned. New developments in archaeology are beginning to discover the real story of ancient Britain. Separated from the rest of Europe, Britain developed in a unique and particular way. It is this uniquely British culture, unique in its beliefs and rituals, in its houses and monuments, in its technology, agriculture and industry, and in its emphasis on family and ancestry that I want people to rediscover. So let's go back in time and uncover the ancient culture we didn't know we had. The Iron Age only lasted for 700 years before the Romans came. At this time, Britain was a country with a rapidly growing population. Communities came together to build defensive hill forts like Maiden Castle, and to create some of the most beautiful works of art in the ancient world. The British Bronze Age goes back another 2,000 years. The invention of bronze had kick-started an industrial revolution on a massive scale. Bronze tools made it easier for Britons to construct complex wood and stone structures, many built as strange religious monuments. The Stone Age occupies the remaining years and takes us right back to when this country first became an island. And it was in the Stone Age that Britain discovered something which was to transform life on this island forever. The invention of farming has to be the single most important development in human history. Once people had gained control of food production, their lives changed beyond recognition. It became possible to settle down and construct fixed societies. Farming was the key to our prosperity.
I think that's it, straight ahead. Yeah.
It was an ancient British farming community that I discovered in East Anglia. While I was looking at some aerial photos of Flag Fen, I noticed something very unusual. 2 parallel crop marks caused by ancient ditches of some kind. What I was to find here clashed with conventional ideas about the origins of farming. To explain, I must go right back to a time when Britain wasn't even an island. It's 10,000 years ago, and we're at the end of the Ice Age. As the ice melts, sea levels rise. Britain is becoming an island, isolated from the rest of Europe. Our isolation persuaded archaeologists that all new developments must have come from abroad.
This revolution, the beginning of farming, did not take place in Europe, but in the Near East, in the river valleys and along the coastlines shown on this map. These new farmers gradually migrated westwards across Europe.
When I was a student, we were taught that farming arrived pretty well fully formed from the eastern Mediterranean, and it had spread across Europe around 5000 BC.
We were running around in skins, being sort of hunters and gatherers, sort of savages, if you like. I mean, suddenly this enormous improvement arrived, and people even called it the Neolithic or farming revolution. And things changed overnight, and it was dramatic and wonderful.
This great revolution was the most important change in all human history.
But there was no such revolution, because the origins of farming had been forming in this country for thousands of years. New research now proves that right from the beginning we did things rather differently. 9,000 years ago, in the Vale of Pickering, Yorkshire, there was a hunting and living site on the edge of a huge post-Ice Age lake. Star Kar was inhabited by humans 4,000 years before the pyramids were built. What was found has made me even more certain that the origins of British farming lay on British soil. Tim Shadler Hall has excavated here.
So we're in the middle of a lake, are we?
Yeah.
Prove it.
Well, I can prove it in all sorts of ways, but this is basically filled with peat. If you stand there,